Thanks for coming out today. So this presentation is going to be a part recap of the industry. As I think you're all aware, last year was another great watershed year for esports, a lot of drive in viewership, in audience. From my perspective as well, I felt it was the first year where the mainstream media stopped looking at us as this kind of zoo animal, and rather as like an industry worth taking seriously. But with this presentation, I wanted to go over some of the key numbers that drove the industry last year and put those into context. I wanted to show some of the things that are disrupting the industry, and then also make some personal predictions for 2019. I warn you, my predictions have a history of failing, but we'll see how that goes. So, for starters, I wanted to just break down some of the key numbers that ruled last year. I mean, as you might have heard, this is supposed to be the year where revenues for esports break the 1 billion mark. But I wanted to start by looking at how much money is actually going into the industry. At the Esports Observer, we report on all disclosed funding in the industry. We also research into funding. And we've calculated that about 4.5 billion was made in disclosed investments in esports last year. That's an increase from 500 million from the year before. And whilst that is an extraordinary number, it's important to put it into context and benchmark it against other. Give it a benchmark. So, what could you actually buy with 4.5 billion? Well, you'd just be about a few million shy of affording the Dallas Cowboys, which is the highest valued sports franchise in the world. Lately, I've noticed a lot of analysts kind of comparing esports now to the NBA in the 1980s, and with that amount of money, you also you'd actually be able to pretty much buy every NBA franchise back in the 1980s. Back then, the highest valued was the Boston Celtics at about 236 million. The average was more about 25 million, which is kind of what the average, the largest esports teams are at the moment. And in fact, you could actually build this exact arena 21 times, maybe give or take a couple of bricks or chairs. Obviously, audience metrics are important. We're in the middle of a Counter-Strike major, and both the majors last year broke viewership records in their own way. For example, the Boston major still holds the record for the highest peak viewership of a Twitch broadcast. I'm quite confident that we might be able to break that this year. But we calculated that across the top 10 esports channels on Twitch, there was 390.2 million total hours watched. That's 45,000 years, 560 human lifespans. One particular focus topic I have as a reporter is I like the intersection between politics and esports. It's very interesting that a lot of governments are starting to look at esports as an economic driver in tourism, in tech, in employment. And I mean, just as an example, the city of Katowice has actually allocated $3.38 million of its budget to promote this event until 2022, with about $649,000 for this particular event. And while the data for this is still quite limited, we've been able to calculate that there is about 300 million in government funding for esports globally at this point, the overwhelming amount of which is coming through China. I'll cover the exact projects they're doing at the moment. It's quite interesting that when you hear about China and gaming, it's always in the context of censorship and the struggle in releasing games there. But when it comes to esports, they're seeing it as a massive cultural asset. Now again, 300 million in esports funding sounds huge, but again, to put it into context, that's about 0.2% of the 2017 budget for the EU. And perhaps a more relatable example, it's 1.5 times the transfer fee Paris Saint-Germain paid for Neymar. So to actually look at some of those investments and see what impact they will have on the industry in the long term, the highest disclosed investment round last year was for Epic Games. It was a venture round that included Axiomatic, the ownership group of Team Liquid, and about 6 other firms. Now, obviously, the assumption is that, well, with the huge growth and popularity of Fortnite, that's what drove it. And certainly, Fortnite, according to Superdata, made about 2 billion in revenue last year. So there is some truth to that. But at the same time, in January, Fortnite's revenue dropped by about 48%, again, according to Superdata. And I don't know if we've reached peak Fortnite at this point, but it's clear that for Epic Games, it's not their long-term strategy. And I think for their investors, that's the same. So for Epic Games, one thing they did is they opened their own game store in December. And it's not as if this is the first major competitor to the Steam store, which is the primary form of online game distribution. There are competitors such as GOG, Origin, Origin and Unity. But the key difference with the Epic Games Store is that it takes 12% of sales compared to Steam, which takes 30%, or at least it did, until they dropped it to 25% to compete with the Epic Games Store. And of course, Epic Games has the Unreal Engine, the most widely used game engine in the industry. I mean, a lot of esports are built on it. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, Gears of War, Mortal Kombat. And one way they've utilized that is that if you place your game on the Epic Games Store, there's no upfront cost for using the Unreal Engine. Another company that's trying to rival Steam's hold of the games marketplace is Discord, which also released its own its own game store. One difference is that you can self-publish through it. It's not through curation. And while they also have a much leaner revenue split of 10% that they keep. Of course, the advantage of Discord as well is that it's a social app. It's the number one tool gamers use to communicate with each other. Two of those other companies were Doya and Huya. Combined, they represent 50% of the Chinese live streaming market, which a recent study done is said that the live stream market for games in China is supposed to reach 4.9 billion by 2022. Now, both these rounds were announced within 24 hours of each other, and both were Tencent investments. If we go back a bit, the one thing that combines all these companies is that Tencent Holdings is present in all of them. Tencent obviously owns 40% of Epic Games and invested in Douyu, China Games, Huya, and Discord. It's very much banking on the Chinese live stream market and esports as a whole. So I also wanted to look at team investments. Last year we saw record level investments for teams, particularly those that have entered franchise leagues. Cloud9 currently has the highest single investment round for an esports team, although as I've listed there, Team Liquid, or rather its ownership group Axiomatic, had two separate funding rounds of 26 and 25 million. Obviously, there's the question then of what exactly investors are looking to get from investing into esports teams at this point, especially those that are engaged in entering these kind of closed franchise leagues that have their own entry fees. So 8 to 13 million for the LCS, or a reported 20 million to 60 million for the Overwatch League. So the first one is brand equity. We've seen a number of professional players move on to create their own esports teams. Ocelot creating G2 Esports, Hector Rodriguez creating Optic Gaming, but we've yet to see that kind of next generational leap where a gamer is raised up to support a certain esports team. And that's largely what the investors of these are looking for, and the franchise system does allow for that to happen. In many cases, a lot of the teams are part of much larger companies. If we look at TSM, Swift Media, they own a number of analytics apps. They recently acquired Blitz Media. Axiomatic, or rather Team Liquid, has its own media influencer agency. It also has a production arm. So whilst the revenues for teams in sponsorship were a little slow in 2018, they're looking to make some alternative revenue through the businesses that these teams are building. And of course, particularly for the owners of traditional sports teams, they're looking to unlock that traditional revenue, ticketing, concessions, media rights, and particularly with leagues like the Overwatch League, which is moving towards this home and away game stadium system. That's what they're hoping to unlock within the next 5 to 10 years. And then on the team side, what are the teams actually raising money for? Well, at the core, it's facilities. Teams are looking to build permanent training facilities to house their players, house their staff, and from this they can then expand further. They can recruit high-quality management and sales teams. They can do more talent development and youth outreach, so they can actually start raising players from the ground up rather than spending huge transfer fees to acquire them. We also saw a number of international expansions last year. For example, Immortals acquired the Made in Brazil brand and have now expanded into Brazil. We saw a number of European soccer teams expand to APAC and Southeast Asia. And of course, we're seeing more teams looking to build out their merchandise, partner with retail partners, and essentially gain more of a mainstream presence. As I mentioned, the training facilities, what do they actually do for teams? Well, for one thing, they move away from the game house model that we saw. In the past, this was the standard way to train players. You put them all in a house together, but it's extremely taxing on the player psychologically. So now we're getting to the point where players come to a dedicated facility, they practice day in, day out, they can practice alongside teams from other games, they can have direct contact with staff. And for sponsors and partners as well, this is extremely important because it gives them the naming rights to the training facilities, such as the Alienware training facility for Team Liquid. The bottom right picture is of Genji's facility in Seoul, where they've actually given the naming rights to their streaming studio to Razer. And then, of course, on top of the money going in, it's also the caliber of the investors. So Imagine Dragons, who kind of came into esports by performing at the League of Legends World Championships, are now co-owners in Rogue alongside Steve Aoki. Drake, who obviously broke the Twitch record with Ninja earlier there, is now co-owner of 100 Thieves. Michael Jordan's getting in. P. Diddy's getting in. I think with a lot of teams, we really haven't seen this the content potential of having these investors on board, but it gives a certain level of credibility to teams and to the brands they're trying to build. So I mentioned, I want to talk about some of the upsets now, some of the things that are disrupting the esports industry. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides, but the one thing, of course, was Fortnite. Fortnite represents a competitive game actually turning to a larger entertainment product. People still play Fortnite to win, but they do it partly as a social experience as well, and that is definitely reflected in Twitch audience. So what we have here is the total hours watched for PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds in 2018, and on top of that, we have Fortnite. And the interesting thing about Fortnite viewership is it's not just streamers, it's also the esports competitions. But for the esports competitions, which are kind of like seasonal weekly tournaments, you're not just watching the main broadcast, you're watching every single player, which tend to be quite popular streamers as well. And certain games have tried to copy this now. So PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds for its global invitational in Berlin, you could watch the different streams for every team. Overwatch now has a premium pass where you can watch player perspective. It's that one thing that doesn't really exist in traditional sports that Fortnite managed to tap into and unlock. And that led to Fortnite being the most watched game on Twitch last year with 1.11 billion total hours watched. About just short of 20% of that was Ninja. We will get to him. And whilst we're going to see kind of the first large-scale third-party esports event for Fortnite take place this weekend, the kind of professional amateur tournament they did at E3 is currently the game's highest watched broadcast at 700,000 peak viewers. So I mentioned Ninja, and he's obviously something entirely new in the gaming industry. He's not a competitive player, as you know. He actually identifies himself as the world's most popular gaming influencer. But he's had significant success there, and he's kind of pioneering the idea of brand ambassadors within gaming. So he had this long-term partnership with Samsung that involved appearing in multiple commercials. He was the first gamer to grace the cover of ESPN. But it shouldn't give the impression that only gaming influencers can get this kind of brand recognition. Probably one of our most read stories of last year was the Chinese League of Legends player Uzi was tapped for a campaign to promote LeBron James' Shut Up and Dribble campaign alongside a famous young Chinese actor. On the right, you have Ramses from Dota 2, he's a Virtus Pro player. He was tapped as an ambassador for Head & Shoulders. What's particularly of interest is that probably wouldn't have been possible the year before the introduction of the Dota Pro circuit, which added more stability for teams in terms of not swapping the roster out all the time. It allowed both Virtus Pro and the player to develop that brand over a longer period of time. And then HyperX have gone the complete other route by actually signing professional athletes who are known for gaming, who are known for streaming, to actually come on board and promote their products, on top of the regular streamers like Stroud. So, turning to Fortnite and to kind of elaborate a bit more about what it's doing to gaming, it's certainly we had the Drake stream last year, but what I thought was most interesting about Fortnite is its live events. These are kind of similar to what you might have seen in an online game like World of Warcraft back in the day. There would be certain seasonal events where you had to log in and play the game at a specific time to see some amazing happening. And this kind of culminated in early 2019 with the Marshmello concert, a live music performance within the game. The funniest thing is when you watch these streams, you always hear someone say, "God, I hope no one kills me right now." And you also saw Fortnite partnering with entities outside of gaming, Marvel or NFL, where you could actually buy individual NFL jerseys. So I also wanted to kind of dive a bit more on esports, like specifically in the competitive scene. So one of the kind of big disruptors we saw was Blizzard Entertainment deciding to reallocate resources from their MOBA Heroes of the Storm. Obviously, Blizzard, Activision Blizzard has their reasons for doing this. They obviously felt they weren't getting enough return on the game, but it does have a very big long-term impact on the industry that an esport can simply be shut down. They moved the development to other games. They canceled the Pro League. They canceled the Collegiate League. There was a bit of grassroots tournaments that followed, but most of the largest teams in Heroes of the Storm have now moved on. And as we know, there's advantages to the open system in Counter-Strike and Dota. There's advantages to the closed ecosystem, like say with League of Legends or Overwatch. But certainly, I would say this is one downside, that if the publisher does feel that the esport or the game isn't really delivering, they can cancel it, and that can have repercussions for those working professionally, either as players or as production staff. Mobile esports is, of course, still the big topic. There were two areas where I saw this kind of expand in a massive way. One was the Clash Royale League, which is kind of the first global esports league for mobile. It culminated in a stadium event in Japan. And the other is, of course, Honor of Kings, which is a kind of League of Legends-esque mobile game in China. And this is the first mobile league to actually franchise. It's not really played too much outside of China, but there you have large stadium events, you have teams buying into the league, and now it's starting to expand to the APAC region, to Southeast Asia, and I think that's in particular a game that's one to watch. I largely became interested in esports through Hearthstone as a card game, and for a long time Hearthstone has been dominant in the esports card game space. And last year was the first time we started to see products actually come out and challenge that. Whilst Artifact unfortunately didn't have the best release, its player count has unfortunately dwindled to several thousand. It immediately started by saying, hey, we're going to give up 1 million in prize money for our first tournament, which is higher than any Hearthstone prize pool ever was. And then, of course, Magic the Gathering is looking to get in a big way by providing $10 million in prize money over the course of this year on top of a professional league. And, of course, Magic has been running for years with the traditional card game space, so they presumably have some idea of how to actually build a thriving ecosystem in a card game. Oh. If you could go to the slide marked Olympic movement. So later on, you're going to hear me speak with Nicholas and Carmack about the Olympic movement. But just to give you some context, I also wanted to see how this particular shakeup in the industry was moving. So this time last year, maybe about a month before, we had the first Olympic-sanctioned esports competition, which was Intel Extreme Masters Pyeongchang. This wasn't a demonstration sport. It wasn't fully part of the Olympic program, but it was the first time that, for example, you could watch an esports event on Olympic channels. This, of course, led to the IOC Forum, where members of the Olympic community, including the IOC itself, its National Olympic committees, actually met with those from the esports industry, publishers, players. And you can see pictured there, you have Echo Fox's owner, Rick Fox, interviewing Ralph, then Blizzard president Mike Morhaime, Nicolas Laurent from Riot Games, and also the head of the Korean Esports Association. It was definitely like a watershed moment for the esports, but unfortunately, the Olympic kind of conversation has stalled a bit since then. Contrary to popular belief, the IOC doesn't really have any problem with esport being this kind of sedentary sport where you're sitting down playing all the time. It actually does recognize esports as a potential sporting activity. What it has problems with, of course, is violence in certain games. Like, there's no chance, for example, that Counter-Strike would ever be part of the Olympic movement. But in addition, I also don't imagine we'd ever be able to turn on the Olympics and hear the word killing spree or double kill. They also have a problem with the fragmentation of the industry, the fact it lacks a federation, the for-profit status for a lot of the games, and the fact that as a tech industry, it moves very fast, and the games played as well move very fast. The cartoon on the left is from a publication called Invent Global, and essentially shows all the game publishers at the dinner table with the IOC and the Asian games, and Activision Blizzard sneezes, knocks Heroes of the Storm off the table. Speaking of the Asian games, there was a lot of talk about this when they actually happened, but I haven't really spoken to many people who actually followed the event as it was happening. So the Asian Games basically ran a demonstration sport at their event last year. This is the second largest multi-sporting event in the world. It didn't award any medals, but it did follow the same standard multi-sporting model, whereby players were recruited by local esports federations in partnership with their national Olympic committees. The event was broadcasted on 14 platforms across 10 countries, and what was most interesting to me is that these weren't amateurs playing, they were professional players. The Korean League of Legends team, for example, was a super team of players. It was Faker, it was Peanut, and if you kind of missed this event and you're into League of Legends, look up the final between China and South Korea. It's some of the best games you'll ever see. There were issues with it, though, particularly in broadcasting. The Chinese audience had no way to actually watch their team compete. This is because one TV channel in China owns the rights to the Asian Games, but it did not own the license to the games being played. In fact, what happened was two streamers in Los Angeles, two Chinese-born Americans, started streaming the competition themselves. Word got out in China, and suddenly one of them had about 500,000 viewers watching his co-stream, or rather unauthorized stream, of the Asian Games. There were also some issues with the technical side of it. There were some on-stage translation issues, delays. We heard from certain reports from players that the living conditions were a bit suboptimal, a kind of fire festival-style sandwiches. And now there's also the issue that the idea was that this would lead to a medal event in 2022, but now that's also looking uncertain. Similar to what happened with the IOC, the Olympic Council of Asia would rather have simulation sports titles plays. It also has a problem with the fact that esports has no single federation to govern it. Again, this is something we'll cover later when we have our Olympic discussion. So I mentioned earlier government projects. This was one story that got a lot of interest from us. In the city of Hangzhou, they've just built an esports town, or rather an esports industrial complex. So the first facility to open there was an arena for LGD gaming, opened in partnership with Allied Esports. And at least from what the government has released, they spent about $280 million building this facility, and they intend to allocate a budget of 2.22 billion leading up to I think 2022, which is also when the next Asian Games arrive in Hangzhou. No relation as far as I can tell. And really, the projects are quite specific. So you'll have more like facilities and venues, but you'll also have an esports training academy, a themed hotel, a business center, and even a hospital for players. And you're actually seeing a lot of these projects being built around China in the cities of Shanghai, Jian, Zhongshan, and Wenzhou. It's very similar. It's basically part of China's specialty towns projects, for those who are familiar with it. This is where, to kind of develop urbanization around China, they're asking towns to kind of pick a specific industry and tailor themselves around it. It's very interesting, and it's something I'll be keeping an eye on, but these movements have been criticized a lot in the past because they encourage blind development on a very risky economic structure. I think some of the towns building these esports things haven't even really got proper authorization yet. And just to focus on a couple of other government projects, so Malaysia's government recently allocated 2.4 million of its budget towards esports. Their current Minister for Youth and Sports is the youngest in the country's history at 26, and he's a Dota 2 player. You can see him pictured here with Razer's CEO, Ming Liang Tan, who himself pledged to match that 2.4 million, as did the founder of M8 Gaming. The issue right now is no one actually knows how that money is going to be spent. Will it be spent on game development or events? The other project I wanted to focus on was from the UK. This is actually was announced in 2019, so it's kind of out the realm of it. But essentially, the UK government awarded a grant to an ESL UK-led project, which is a co-partnership with the University of York and a number of other private companies to develop broadcasting software. It's not going to be a company or a product per se, but it's designed to find alternative ways to monetize the viewing experience of esports. So what's next? Obviously, I wanted to look at some of the games that have been played. Right now, Apex is getting a lot of attention. If you look at the chart at the bottom, that's the viewership again for PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, Fortnite, and at the end there, you can see Apex on its week of release. Right now, it's kind of tapered a bit, as these games tend to do after 2 to 3 weeks. But again, it's bringing something different to the Battle Royale genre, and in general, I say I'm quite bullish on it as a potential esport. Another one that I don't know how many of you have heard of is Dota Auto Chess, which to me is much more traditional as an esport than what we've seen, in the sense that a lot of the most popular esports, Counter-Strike, Dota 2, were originally community-created projects. This one was created by a development team of 5 people, and yet it's reached 90,000 players in the West, and last we checked, obviously these figures are always a bit dodgy, but last we heard it was at about 320,000 players in China. Right now, its major issues is that the characters it uses, or the chess pieces, it's worth pointing out that Dota Auto Chess isn't really Dota or chess, it's more like Mahjong. But the pieces they use, they don't have the copyright to use these at this point. And they also have the issue, as with a lot of games in China, of another developer coming on and copying your idea before you're able to monetize it. And we have heard reports that Valve are actually looking to acquire the license to the game and release it themselves. Two things I personally see as a big part of this year is, first, what is the role of media rights? We'll have a discussion later here to get specific, but I personally see platform agnosticism becoming a thing, in the sense of there will be less exclusive streaming deals and more esports content available on all platforms. How you actually then monetize that is the next big question. And there's, of course, the idea of multi-platform play. So right now, Fortnite, you can play it on PC, console, and mobile, and you can actually play each other on those different platforms. There's only 2 or 3 other games that can do that right now, but I would imagine more games that come out would try to replicate this to kind of copy the Fortnite effect, even if it isn't necessarily the best thing from a competitive gaming standpoint. So my personal predictions, I think we're going to see more teams move to game-specific brands. I think some of the top ones like Team Liquid and Cloud9 will keep the kind of multi-game roster because that's what they built their brand upon. But as we saw with the Overwatch League, which did kind of force this idea, is you'll ultimately get more teams that feel that they can build that value by sticking to one game. So for example, when Refresh Entertainment entered the League of Legends European Championship, they decided not to use the Astralis brand. They instead acquired Origen and decided to revitalize that brand. And when I spoke to Jacob Lund Christensen, I said, why did you do that? He said, well, I have this issue that one day I'd have 2 Astralis fans meet in the street, and they would actually be supporting completely different teams. Sorry? The second is, I think a lot more Western companies and team owners will start to host teams in the APAC region, Korea, China, Japan. Just last week, Comcast Spectacor announced its joint venture with SK Telecom to essentially rebrand, one of the biggest teams of League of Legends. And similarly, we saw Paris Saint-Germain expand go to Asia last year with a kind of interesting idea to partner with a Chinese team and co-brand the team itself. And I think this is kind of something that will increase this year as more teams look for an entry into Asia, where, as I said, there are specific games unique to that region that they want to build their brand around. And the last one is, I would say the majority, I wanted to say every, but I was advised to be a bit more cautious. I think the majority of esports teams and leagues will have apparel partners, specific clothing brands, similar to what you would see in sports. So right now, as pictured there, Cloud9 have their deal with Puma, but you also have brands like Snipes and Adidas that are slowly partnering more and more teams, building unique clothing lines. And maybe if it's not with non-endemic clothing brands, it will be with endemic ones. So for example, We Are Nations is now the official apparel provider for the LCS. So in the same way that only Nike can provide clothing for the NBA, they're the ones handling the clothing rights for there. And I think at this point, it's very unlikely that you'll see many teams actually creating their own merchandise. Even if they white label the clothing to another brand, it's still the idea that adding an apparel partner obviously offers a lot of incentives for them. That's all from me. I'll take any questions now if you have any, but yeah, thank you for listening.
Graham Ashton, everybody. Does anyone have any questions for Graham? I will happily come to you. Yes, conveniently placed front row, man. Thank you.
Hello, Graham. I'm a journalist from China.
Hi.
Actually, I'm very impressed by your PPT slides about the Esports Town projects in China.
Yeah.
Actually, starting from 2016, there was 1 or 2 Esports Town projects in China. They all want to copy the success of Katowice. So, in your opinion, the success of Katowice, I mean the esports city, is it copyable?
You mean copyable outside of China?
copyable outside of Katowice because all those esports town projects in their business plan they say we want to copy the success of Katowice to build a esports city like this city.
I mean, from what I've heard from those who are actually building these towns, the ministries involved tend to, as you would expect, not have a lot of knowledge of gaming and not a lot of esports. So they obviously turn to the companies for their expertise in building these facilities. I can't imagine you doing it. I mean, this is one of those things where you have to work with the private sector. I really couldn't imagine you being able to build these facilities purely through government funding. For example, in Arlington, we have the esports stadium built there. That was funded by the local government, and then it was built by Populous, which is a venue provider, and then it's been run by Engage Esports, which is like an event coordinator. So whilst, I mean, ultimately, I think the local governments are going to have to be providing the funding. They would probably need to partner with esports-specific companies to actually accomplish the goal they're getting with them. I don't know if that quite answers your question.
A little bit.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, hello.
I have a pretty important question when it comes to the argument that there is violent games and Olympic doesn't want to include them. But what about fighting sports and all the things we've seen in the Olympic movement throughout the years? We know that in ancient Olympia we had really nasty fighting sports. What's your take on that?
I mean, we'll definitely see that discussed a bit later when we have the Olympic thing, but I think the issue with violence in the Olympics is that the IOC has never been specific on what they mean by that, because obviously a game like Counter-Strike, which isn't just violence with blood, it has political kind of imagery in it as well. But then you have something like League of Legends, which was played at the Asian Games. It's more fantasy violence, right? I mean, killing is involved, but is that where the threshold is? Do fighting games technically then, would those certainly be considered okay because it's like the equivalent of boxing or wrestling? It's one of those weird kind of minutiae subjects where I believe at the IOC forum, in a one-on-one discussion with Thomas Bach, the IOC commissioner, someone raised, the player he was speaking to, an Overwatch player, he raised the point saying, you're famous for fencing, a sport that is lethal in its origins. And he's kind of brushed that off by saying, yes, but it's not simulation killing. I think it's just a weird gap, it's a cultural gap at the end of the day. Like, most gamers have grown up with violent games. It's just, we've kind of become used to these being nothing more than simulations. But I think for people unfamiliar to gaming, it's a little alarming at first. And I think that maybe that's something that can be resolved with more dialogue. Or maybe it's just a certain wall that the IOC can never get past.
Thank you for that. I have two more questions for you, Graham. One over here.
Hello. So I'm Algeria from North African Cyber League. You are talking about the future of esport. Do you think the market would be more difficult in Europe and American for the brand? And what do you think Africa, and specifically North Africa, can be the future of the smallest brand to make good business with the esports?
Just so if I understand your question, are you saying, what do I see in the future in North Africa in esports? I'm actually South African originally, so I take a lot of interest in how, in Africa, the continent and how it's developing in esports, just because I feel it's one of the most underdeveloped and one of the slowest. Be honest, I don't know a lot exactly about what's going on in North Africa and countries there. I don't really know a lot about the tournaments and leagues there, or even what the ecosystem is like. I'd be happy to chat later if you have any information on that, but I'm afraid I don't know much.
And last question for you, Graham.
Hello, my name is Daniel from the Hungarian Esports Federation, and we organized a regional event called V4 last year that was funded by the Hungarian government. They gave us 6 million euros to organize these events. So how do you see, is this trend going to continue in Europe, that cities and governments are going to invest more and more in esports?
I think they definitely will. I mean, they have to see what benefits come to them, whether it's something like Katowice, where it pulls in more tourism, or whether it's something that can drive more if it drives local employment. I mean, again, I'd be interested to talk to you and find out. You say it was Portugal that. well, either way, I'd be interested to know, putting that much money for an event, ultimately, what were they looking to get out of it? This year, you're also going to see basically an esports summit or tournament in Tokyo, and the Tokyo government have allocated a portion of their funding to it as well. And Japan is another very slow-moving esports market. I think different governments will have different reasons for putting their money forward, and maybe a bit more familiarity with what gaming can provide to them. But certainly, I think that number, 300 million, you're going to see that, I wouldn't say double by next year, but it will certainly increase a hell of a lot.
Thank you very much for your questions, everybody, and thank you to Graham Ashton.